I now recognize Mr. Mills for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the panel for everyone coming here and for your time of service. It's greatly appreciated. I want to comment on a few things because every time that we try to get to the bottom of the final decision making, which is always at the behest of the Commander-in-Chief, somehow we find ourselves spending more time talking about Trump all over again. And I understand my left's infatuation and the Trump deranged syndrome, which overwhelms them, and I do hope that through NIH or others they can seek help. The whole point is that this was a conditions-based agreement. It was very clear from the beginning that if the conditions were not met, and as you said, General Sadat, that there was a plan B, an alternative mechanism. The other thing that our colleagues continue to fail to acknowledge is that President Trump, towards the end of his presidency, had actually reversed his decision at the advisory of the generals and was going to maintain troops there to continue its support. We fail to always mention that piece of things. And it's funny to me that Biden, and Mr. Roggio, you said it so perfectly just now, I couldn't have said it better. He was so willing to do what was necessary to make sure that the fall of Somalia did not occur with the government there. He was so quick to go ahead and withdraw the Remain in Mexico agreement, but for some reason, that Doha agreement, he couldn't make any changes to whatsoever. It was absolutely mandatory. No one could change anything, even though he's the elected president. That wasn't a complete possibility. Can't understand that, but that's something else. The other thing is that I do agree with my colleague. There were many missteps in playing political football through multiple administrations and their understanding of what we're supposed to be doing and what the mission was to achieve. We were not originally there, as we all remember in 2001, to think about nation building. We were there for an actual counterterrorism operation, which was to go in and stop Afghanistan from being a safe haven of terror and to withdraw. What did we leave? We left the Haqqani network, ISIS Khorasan, the Taliban, billions of dollars in equipment, and stronger now than they were before, and actually closer, I would argue, to achieving the goal of what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was trying to achieve with a caliphate and a singular ISIS cohesion, which is what we've left them, a full country to now terrorize, exploit, and to utilize. He's right that there was over 10 Congresses who had gotten this wrong, which is why I ran for Congress. One of the main reasons was to try and come in here to prevent what we've continued to see. Because the majority of Congress, by the way, only 17% were actual military veterans. And we wonder why we get it wrong. You know, in my military and government service, I spent over 7 years of my life in Iraq, over 3 years in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Pakistan, northern Somalia. I know a thing or two about poor decision-making. And I'll go ahead and say this. It was not the fault of the boots on the ground who was carrying out their objectives, missions. It was the suits in D.C. who was ruining the entire thing. But we need to understand something. What we're looking into is not just the fall of Afghanistan, but also, again, accountability for what is already being forgotten, and it is shameful, shameful, that we're already forgetting our 13 heroes who had fallen at Abbey Gate. You know, our State Department sat in here talking about how they were there on the ground helping to find solutions, and they were with the troops day and night when those gates were available to help Americans and others to be able to get out. But my question still remains to the State Department, if you were there day and night with our military service veterans at those gates, then why do we have 13 fallen service members and not a single State Department member who had fallen with them? That doesn't tell me that you were at the gates when it was necessary. Mr. Roggio, I got a question for you, sir. Prior to the U.S. full withdrawal from Afghanistan, you looked at publicly available information and warned that Afghanistan was likely to fall to the Taliban by the end of summer of 2021, which is exactly what we saw happen. Same thing that we warned about, because we knew that NPRI and others, and again, I think it's a different hearing, but we should be actually setting up a subcommittee that reviews the subcontractors who is more worried about supplying information that basically showed them in a positive light so they could win more contracts and follow-ups, as opposed to the ground reality where they were evaluating the willingness to fight, the necessary equipment, and the strategy on the ground. But having said that, from your perspective, was the problem with the conflicting or incomplete intelligence, the leaders, or was it both?
Sir, I think a mix of both in my experience. I created the map that we all saw on television over the summer of 2001, where I assessed the security in the districts. I started that, I think, in 2014 because I was testing the Taliban's counter strategy to ours. The Taliban said, fine, you want to protect the cities and key districts, we'll go in the rural districts and we'll meet you in the cities. and I began gathering data, and over time it became very clear to me that the Taliban had a strategy and it was implementing it. The problem, I think, was I can't just blame the suits, sir. I think that part of our military leadership and the top level leadership within the intelligence community is also responsible for this, and they need to be held to account. We were given very rosy assessments that I could easily disprove, and journalists who and other experts who covered, for instance, there were times where the U.S. estimate that was released by SIGAR would say, like, the province of Kunduz, which I can't remember, I think it has 7 districts. The SIGAR would say something like, oh, only 1 or 2 are Taliban controlled and 1 or 2 contested. Everyone who followed Afghanistan closely would know that just about all the districts were contested, and the Taliban controlled at least 2 districts at a time. So this is what I saw, and some of this was because generals didn't want this stuck on their performance view. Some of this was political because, you know, look, you had General Miller stand up and say, after he canceled SIGAR's reporting of the data on the districts, he stood up and said, well, it doesn't matter. Security in the districts doesn't matter. What matters is negotiations with the Taliban. The top level of the U.S. military was infected by this political solution, this negotiated solution, and that has significant effects. People that I have spoken to during this, that were in the military or intelligence services, people that worked, that did the hard work, they understood what was happening in Afghanistan. But as the information made it up the chain of command, it was softened and softened. And why did we need to have, for instance, statements like, there's only 50 to 100 al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan, or the Taliban ties to al-Qaeda are weak or non-existent? Because ultimately, 3 presidents wanted to leave Afghanistan. President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden all wanted to leave. And in order to do so, there could not be significant ties between the Taliban and al-Qaeda could not have a significant presence. Look, that's another thing that I tracked here. They would tell us 50 to 100 al-Qaeda were in Afghanistan, and yet we would kill anywhere from 25 to 75 al-Qaeda that were operating. This is from U.S. military's own press releases that I would track. So did al-Qaeda have this sort of steady state where they kept it at 50 to 100, with this estimate stayed the same? It only went away when we conducted a raid on a terrorist training, or 2 al-Qaeda training camps in Kandahar in October 2015, I believe it was, and they killed almost 200 al-Qaeda fighters. So, you know, I apologize for telling a long story here, but there was significant problems within the military. I'm talking the higher level leadership within the military, within the intelligence community, and with our political leadership. And I do hope that a committee is set up to get to the bottom of these key issues, because, you know, if what happened in Afghanistan stayed in Afghanistan, oh, well, fine, we lost a brush war. Sorry, my Afghan friends who are friends. And I obviously am being sarcastic there, because we should maintain commitments to our allies, but it doesn't. What happens if we're getting it wrong in Ukraine? What happens if we're getting it wrong with Taiwan and China? You know, these are the questions that we need to ask.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing the witness to go ahead and fully answer this. I agree we have a counting issue. We didn't know how many Americans were left in Afghanistan. When they said 300, 3,000, 30,000, didn't know. We continue to get this wrong, and that's why we shouldn't engage in warfare unless we're willing to see it through, get back to an America First agenda, and make sure that we're doing this right so we don't repeat Afghanistan again. With that, I yield back.